I was once so silenced by fear that I couldn't speak. One of my 6-word memoirs says it best, and here it is. Cat got your tongue? Not anymore. I'm Marilyn Bosquin, founder of Writing Women's Lives Academy, and I tell you, it took me a long time to get from cat got your tongue to not anymore. Long before I started submitting my work for publication, I kept my writing hidden in my notebooks. Like so many women who were raised to be good, I had learned that there are some things you just don't talk about, and you sure as hell don't write them down. That would be shameful, never mind the truth. Well, these so-called shameful parts of my own experience as a female were the very truths that kept making their way to the pages of my notebook. And this caused a huge inner conflict for me. On the one hand, I had this burning desire to write, and on the other hand, I had this deep shame about the stories that wanted to be written. And instead of seeing this conflict for what it was, my truth wanted to be told and it wanted me to tell it in my unique voice, I concluded that I wasn't a real writer, that real writers don't have this inner battle raging inside them every time they sit down to write. I remember this one time sitting at this pie hutch that doubled as my writing desk when I was in my mid-20s, and I had just watched Anita Hill's opening statement in the Clarence Thomas hearing confirmations. And I knew with every fiber of my being as I listened to Anita Hill speak that she was telling the truth. Her words brought silent tears to my cheeks, and I didn't understand why at the time. But when she finished speaking, I walked across our small apartment, sat down at that pie hutch, and I started writing in my notebook. And it was one of the first times an experience from my past that I considered then to be a shameful experience made its way to the page. And in the coming weeks, I wrote so fiercely about this experience that the tip of my pen tore the notebook pages. Well, it turns out that silencing is fueled not only by shame, right, but also by rage. And this internal war, my desire to write versus this internalized silencing, it was painful. It was so painful that there was a time I tried not to write. After all, I wasn't a real writer, right? But guess where I'd find myself every night during that time after I put my son to sleep? Right back, not put him to sleep, but after he went to sleep, right back in my notebooks. And I continue to write and learn the craft of writing. I love craft, and I even went back and got my MFA in creative nonfiction so I could master the craft of memoir. And I'm really, really glad I did, because becoming craft savvy has just made me a much better writer. But even with tons of craft knowledge under my belt, that harsh voice in my head tells me so many mean things, including that I wasn't a real writer. And what I learned is that you can learn all the crafts in the book, but if you haven't done that inner consciousness work that frees your voice from silence, craft skills can only take you so far. So I did the inner work. I got to know how female conditioning, which literary critic J. Brooks Broussard calls a prolonged immersion in shame. I got to know how that shame showed up in my writing practice and how it kept my writing stuck in silence. And I came to know the many ways that my inner critic told me that I wasn't a real writer. And I now understand that the conflict that raged within me for so long, that it wasn't a reflection of who I was as a writer. It stemmed from female conditioning. And it was a conflict between my deep, wise writing self, what I now call my writing truth, and internalized shame and silencing, which I now recognize as my small, scared self, or my inner critic. And these two parts of me were like bumping heads, coming to blows at times. And your inner critic, the harsh voice in your head that criticizes your writing and tells you every which way it can that you're not a real writer and that you don't have a story and nobody wants to read what you have to say, so why bother? This inner critic is never, ever, ever the truth of who you are. And I cover much more of this in depth in Craft Your Truth, Claim Your Voice. But for now, know that your inner critic sees its job as protecting you. And I know that sounds crazy, but there was a time when silence kept you safe. And though silence no longer serves you, to paraphrase the late, great Audre Lorde, your small, scared self doesn't know that. So the moment you begin to voice your truth, your small self starts beating the drum in an attempt to, what we can say, maintain the status quo of silencing that used to keep you safe. So one of your jobs now is to, as a writer, is to discern between your deep, wise writing self, that voice of truth that drives you to the page like mine did during Anita Hill's testimony, and your inner critic, that scared voice of silence that no longer serves you and in fact jeopardizes your writing and your well-being. And this discernment, it requires inner consciousness work so that you can get really, really savvy about how internalized silencing shows up in your writing. Craft Your Truth, Claim Your Voice is a unique writing program that is near and dear to my heart. It's the program I was searching for when I was in so much turmoil about my writing. What is it that Toni Morrison says? That if there's a book you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it? Something like that. Well, Craft Your Truth, Claim Your Voice is the writing program that hadn't been created yet, so I created it. This program is the only writing program that I'm aware of that integrates the craft skills essential to writing memoir with the inner consciousness work necessary for you to claim your voice and your truth from the cultural shame and silencing that keeps so many women's stories untold still. If this sounds like a class that you've been searching for, I would love to bear witness to your story told in your unique voice. No one else on the planet has your voice, and no one can tell your story. And those tears that I cried way back when I was listening to Anita Hill tell her story, I now know that those tears were a natural reaction to recognizing a piece of my story in Anita Hill's brave voice. And if she had not spoken her truth, I might not have started to uncover mine. And that's the power of one woman's voice to free another woman's voice from silence. If now is your time to do the inner work of freeing your voice from silence in a sisterhood that is not afraid of tears, come join us. Would love to have you. Much writing love.